Growing up, my parents told me never to go into the basement. It is kind of interesting now that I think back on it. I was an obedient kid and never did anything that my parents told me not to. But I also never once questioned, until very recently, why I wasn't allowed to go down those stairs. Our house was huge. My dad worked in finance, but grew up a country boy before college, so as soon as we had the chance, we moved us out into isolation, even though this made his commute over an hour into town. I loved it, especially when I was younger, because we had lots of animals on our property, some wild and some actually owned by my parents. My mum would stay home and take care of the chickens and the geese while I watched and played with them. My mum would always tell me not to get too close with the animals, because we would sell some of them from time to time, and she didn't want my feelings to get hurt. I did my best to follow her instructions, but I have to admit, there were definitely some animals I missed when they got sold off. I spent many evenings after the long bus ride home from school, sitting out back with the animals, watching the sun go down over the wide open fields. It was more peaceful than words could describe. But of anywhere on the acres and acres of property, the only place I wasn't allowed to be was that basement. I once tried to walk down with my mum when she went downstairs to do the laundry. I offered to hold the basket of dirty clothes for her as she went down the steps, thinking that she would definitely appreciate the help. But I was terribly wrong. As soon as my foot hit that top step behind her, and before I could squeak out my offer to assist her, she turned around and pushed my back using the laundry basket. Not a hard push, but enough of one to force me back through the door and into the kitchen. "What have I told you?" she said to me. "What have I said about coming down here?" I apologized and hung my head, feeling like a bad kid. She could sense that and patted me on the head. "It's okay," she said. "Just don't do that again. You need to stay up here. Why don't you go see if any of the chickens have laid eggs? I forgot to go out this morning and I would love the help." I smiled and agreed to do it, walking out the back kitchen door towards the coop, my mum closing the basement door behind her before I even made it outside. The weather was terrible a few winters ago. We were pummeled by the snow and, unfortunately, a lot of the animals died on the farm. Don't get me wrong, we were okay and everything. Again, farming was more of a hobby than a means of income or survival, but I was pretty upset by the animals no longer being there. For some reason, my parents got jittery and seemed to be more and more out of character the longer we were forced to be in the house. We had plenty of food, and our power hadn't gone out, so I couldn't figure out what it was that they were freaking out over, besides being stuck and not being able to go outside. There was a knock at the door a week or two into the snowstorm, and I remember how strange it was that we would have a visitor. We never had visitors. We were pretty far out into the sticks and people didn't swing by or anything, especially without letting us know first. My dad answered the door, and there was a young man lacking all color and covered head to toe in white, thick snow. He thanked my father graciously for opening the door and explained his situation. His car had broken down about 6 or 7 miles up the road, and he didn't know where to go. He didn't have a cell phone, and he was traveling across the country, so he didn't know who he would have contacted anyway. My father invited him in, and all of a sudden, that jittery sense about my parents started to float away. They seemed more calm now that this stranger was in the house, and it was such a peculiar situation that I just had to sit back and watch. I listened to this man tell us that he didn't have any family living except a sister that he hadn't spoken to in years, and that he was on his way to Boston to start fresh. He said that his mother had passed away only a few months prior and pulled out a tiny gold locket on a chain. He told us that it belonged to her and that it was the only thing he had left of her. I smiled and nodded at him, still not saying a word. After he spoke for a few minutes, my parents realized that the snow covering his clothing was melting and that everything he had on was soaked. My mother looked at my father and said to the man, "Would you like to change? You and my husband seem to be about the same size. You could borrow some of his clothing for now." My father nodded along. The stranger stood and shook my father's hand, thanking him over and over again while my mom led him towards the kitchen. "Our laundry room is right this way. I'm sure we can find you something." She opened the basement door and gestured the man towards it. Without hesitation, he started down the wooden steps. My father came to me and told me to go upstairs and get ready for dinner. I said okay and walked up the large staircase, not even thinking twice about the request. When I came downstairs, my mom and dad were setting the table. I asked if the stranger would be joining us, but without even looking up at me, they said that he had left. I didn't know what to say to that, because he had almost frozen to death just getting to the house, and the closest town wasn't for miles and miles. There was no way he would make it back. My parents told me to have a seat, and dinner went along like nothing happened. But I finally got curious. This man couldn't have just disappeared into thin air. I had to know what was going on in the basement. I had to know if he ever came back up. I was young but not stupid. I knew that something was wrong. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, I grabbed the flashlight from my drawer and started down the stairs towards the kitchen. The floors creaked, so I had to really take my time, making sure I didn't wake up my parents in the process. When I finally touched the tile of the kitchen, a small wave of relief came over me, and I took a break to steady my breathing, seeing as how I'd been holding my breath as I moved across the hardwood. I finally reached out to the knob on the basement door, checked around me one last time, and opened the door with a creak. I placed my foot on the step, which felt much older than the stairs. The air as I head down smelled sweet, but a foul kind of sweet. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I came down to the concrete floor and listened the best I could. Silence. Nothing. I flashed the light around to see a washer and dryer, just as I'd expected, and some boxes of what I remembered to be old clothes and such, but nothing really out of the ordinary. I was turning to head back up the stairs, now feeling silly and actually pretty sour with myself for not listening to my parents when something shiny caught my eye. I turned the flashlight on it and walked over to where it lay on the floor. It was the golden locket the stranger had showed us from his mother. I picked it up and leaned myself against the wall to examine it further when the wall started to move with my shifting weight. I jumped back, frightened, and shined my flashlight on the wall, realizing that it was in fact fake. Being the curious kid I was, and still clutching the locket, I moved the wooden portion of the wall out of the way, revealing a shallow hole. What I saw in there is something that has changed my life forever. Inside the hole sat a creature. This thing looked like a human, like a boy, but quite different. His limbs were much longer than a regular person, wildly disproportionate from its body. At the end of each arm were bony fingers with sharp claws that this thing curled over and over again bind its face. Its eyes were pitch black with no pupils. It was a hairless beast, and its ears were simply torn holes in the side of its head. The mouth stretched across its face into a large, sharp-toothed grin. It had no clothing besides a small cloth covering its lower abdomen. Around its neck was a thick chain attached to the concrete wall. It stared at me, smearing what looked like blood across its wrinkled face, smiling. My foot hit something, and I looked down briefly, trying to not take my eyes off of this beast or creature or whatever it was. A hand. Too afraid to scream, I turned and started running towards the stairs. I only took about 3 or 4 steps before crashing into my parents, who stood over me with their arms crossed, shaking their heads. My dad put his arm around my shoulder and led me up the stairs into the living room, while Mai covered up the hole. The chickens and animals that I missed were sold. My dad didn't grow up on a farm or like living in isolation, but rather felt as though we had to. We had no neighbors for a reason. It was planned that way. Our whole lives up to this point, even now, years later, has revolved around my older brother in the basement and keeping him fed. Now, when I think back to the excuses my parents used to make, I feel like an idiot. I remember being 12 years old, standing at the top of the staircase and watching all of the people filing into our basement. Some men wore white masks, some women wore bonnets, but they all had small suitcases, as though there was a bus stop beneath our house, and every one of them looked pale, frightened. My mother would catch me watching from above and send me off to bed, but not before I could ask what was happening. "We're just going to talk about grown-up things, baby." Her voice was sweet and high-pitched. She always sounded happy, regardless of how concerned she looked. "One day you will join us too. For right now, though, you should get some sleep." But I didn't sleep. I never could, with the images of those people's blanched faces in my mind, men and women alike, all terrified. I would lie awake in bed with my ear pressed to the mattress, covering the other side of my head with a pillow. From inside my shell, the heavy thudding from below was transformed into the sounds of marshmallows bouncing around. The screams that would follow were instead turned into a murmuring kind of one-note melody. One after another, the unique notes of each person would resound and then die away. My entire childhood consisted of this nightly succession of muffled marshmallows and melodies coming from the invisible bus stop in the basement. And then reality hit, literally. One day Manuel came up to me at school and pushed me hard against the lockers. He punched me in the stomach twice before he even said a word. Only when he saw that the teachers were forcing their way through the crowded hall did he ask me, "Why is my mother at your house?" What? I neither knew what his mother looked like, nor where she had been. It was such a weird question, but something inside of me twisted at the thought of the people coming in. I pictured what his mother might look like, her caramel Latina skin looking pale from the terror that would inevitably seize her, because it seized them all. "I'm sorry," I said. "My dad just sits in his room and cries." He bellowed in my face. He punched me again, this time in my face. The teachers were upon us, restraining him. "Where is she?" he yelled as he was dragged away. "I know she's there, puto. Tell me she's there." I apologized again. "Please, just tell me she's there." His voice was breaking now. He sounded like he was tearing up a little. "Isn't she? Is that where she is? Her name is Gloria. Please, is she okay? Is she—" He couldn't hold it back any longer. The teachers gave him enough room to move, and he instantly pushed his hands over his face, hiding the tears that were coming now. 3 years passed, and I had started getting a reputation. At least I'm guessing that's what happened, because people completely stopped trying to talk to me as soon as I was in high school. Mother explained that people just turn into bad people the older they get. She said that's why, when they get to be full-grown adults, they come to our house to try and fix things. I was just about to ask her again what goes on in the basement, but I stopped myself. I was developing a plan now, to infiltrate the basement and finally see for myself. I knew all my parents would say is, "You're not old enough." It always made me feel like I was still a little child, the way they said it. But I was starting to resist. I was starting to crave that feeling that I saw all of the other kids at school expressing. They looked so mature, so grown up. I felt somehow that the only way to get there would be to sneak into the basement while my parents went to the grocery store. Only recently had I found where Dad hid the key to the basement door that was locked from the outside. I had stumbled on a secret drawer in the kitchen when I was looking for a potato peeler. I knew it had to be the key because it had a weird engraving that was identical to tattoos that some of the strangers would have on the backs of their hands. It looked like a snake that was eating its own tail. As soon as the front door swung shut behind them, I launched downstairs and took up the key. I had expected to need a lot of time to rummage around the basement and see what was going on down there, but I expected wrong. The minute I swung the basement door open, I was overcome with the strong, foul smell that I knew could only be the smell of death. There was no light switch on the wall, but I found a flashlight hanging on a peg instead. I flipped the beam on and slowly waded through the stench, down the steps, where the air got colder and colder. I could hear the low sounds of moaning, echoing throughout the subterranean passage. At the base of the stairs, there was only cold concrete and bare, steel-looking walls enclosing everything. I stepped on something squishy and lunged forwards away from it as it spoke. "Am I forgiven?" The flashlight beam knifed into an emaciated, poor-looking woman with shackles chaining her feet to the floor. Her eyes refracted a silvery kind of liquid as though she had cataracts in both of her eyes. I said nothing and staggered further in until I saw a low red light glowing around the corner. A hearth was glowing hot at the very end of the basement. It was there that my flashlight fell upon something I could never have imagined. A man, just as withered as the woman chained behind me, was pulling a poker out of the hearth. It was a steel rod with the sign of the serpent on the end, glowing red hot. "Forgive me," he whispered to no one. He drove the burning end into his stomach, where it sizzled like water in a grease pan. As he did, he let out a scream that matched those I heard at night. Everything was collapsing on top of me. It was here that they brought their suitcases to stay. This was where they congregated and did... what? I couldn't even fathom. A wave of nausea overcame me. I wobbled, almost toppling over myself before dropping my flashlight and resting my hands on my knees. It was all I could do to keep from vomiting everywhere. As I hunkered down, I noticed a small pool of blood that trailed off to the right. I regained myself as best I could and followed it off to the side of the room. There was a closet, and as I drew nearer, the smell of death and decay became almost unbearable. I reached my hand out to the closet, but something stopped me. Someone else, much stronger, had seized my wrist. I spun around to find my father staring gravely down at me, his face lit from the feeble glow of the hearth. "You don't want to see what's in there," he said. He smiled at me a little mysteriously. He seemed so natural in the midst of this chamber of death. "What is this place?" I asked at last. "This place," he said, reaching down to my ankles and latching something metal around me, "is your new home for the next 2 years. Apparently you are ready to be an adult, just like the others. You've proven that by disobeying me. So now you too must find forgiveness." I knew I could not resist. Still, I had too many questions. All of those childhood uncertainties were culminating into this absurd place that reeked of death. I asked him again for a straight answer, as he took his time attaching my shackles to a bolt shared by a corpse that lay decaying on the floor. "This is hell," he said simply. "The knowledge has been handed down to us that God no longer has patience to forgive those who sin against him. On earth, man runs rampant like a disease. It is now only through suffering in our physical bodies that we may repent. It is only through serving in hell on earth that we may be purged from the eternal fire in death. Atonement must be made." A million objections sprang up in my mind, but somehow a part of me could not resist. A part of me felt that this must be, if only because it came from my father. A part of me knew I deserved this, and longed to be nearer the hearth, so I could burn the apology into my skin. But I wasn't as lucky as that man, who died 2 months later, and was taken to the closet in the side of the room with the rest of the bodies. No, I was shackled up next to the withered woman named Gloria, who seemed clueless when I told her that her son was looking for her. "I'm a sinner," was all she said. "I must find forgiveness." I was home alone for the week, as my family had gone on vacation while I had to stay and work. It was around 2 a.m., and I'd stayed up to watch a scary movie in the dark in my basement. I was intent on really scaring myself and seeing how far into terror I could really go, while still knowing I was safe in my own home. It was then that I heard pounding footsteps on the first floor. This was a common, annoying occurrence when my family was home. Every time they passed through the front hallway, past the basement door, I heard their footsteps. This time fear immediately shot through me at the sound. My reflex was to turn the television off immediately. The basement door was up a flight of steps and around a corner, so whoever it was would not have seen any light. I heard the basement door handle click and turn as I sat in absolute darkness. I moved slowly so as to be absolutely silent and crawled behind our large television. As I passed it inch by inch, I noted with panic that its black screen still dimly glowed. I heard footsteps coming down the carpeted but creaky stairs. I froze in my hiding place, listening. For many long minutes I heard nothing. Had the intruder seen the television's afterglow, or had it faded in time? Was he standing in the pitch dark, listening for me? I seemed to lie there in total silence for an interminably long time. My panic began to fade, and I began to think more clearly. Had I really heard an intruder? Could someone possibly be standing there in silence for so long without making any noise? The basement was so exceedingly quiet that the silence itself began to hurt my ears. Could the unknown person really avoid any noise from shuffling or breathing or anything else? If there was an intruder, he was still in the basement, because the creaky stairs were incredibly loud, the door handle clicked, and he wouldn't know to mask his footsteps on the first floor so that they couldn't be heard down here. I began counting in my head, trying to pass the time, as drool fell from my mouth onto the carpet. I didn't dare risk the sound of swallowing. I reached 60 seconds once, twice, 30 times, 60 times. By now my fear had faded and I was more confused than anything. I estimated I'd been crouched in the absolute black for almost 2 hours and had still heard nothing. If there was an intruder, none of this made sense. Finally, I decided I'd have to make a move. If I did nothing, eventually the sun would come up and shine in through the small basement windows. And worse, I began to smell something horrible and cloying. Slowly, Ever so slowly, I began inching my way towards the stairs by way of the walls. If someone was standing there in the dark, I should be able to go around them and then make a break up the stairs. Meanwhile, the horrible odor grew stronger. Had something died down here in the night? No living person would smell like that. Terrible images of some sort of corpse monster listening for me in the dark erupted in my thoughts, and I moved as fast as I could without making a sound. Just as I finally approached the stairs, there was an enormous clatter, as of something falling or collapsing on the floor. It was at that moment I leapt forward and crashed up the stairs, running out through the open basement door and my wide-open front door. Now certain that someone was in the house, I called the police from my cell phone and watched my house from afar. The police came, checked inside the house, and then grimly came back out to question me. They'd found a body in the house, my elderly neighbor, who seemed to have died of a heart attack. Their belief was that I must have left the front door unlocked, and he must have wandered in my house while dying looking for help. At first I felt horrible, thinking that I had sat there in the dark while the old man literally died a few feet away. Then it occurred to me, what the hell was that loud noise of things falling? That last prompted me to bolt up the stairs and out of the house. I asked the police, and they confirmed the back door of my house had been left open as well, near a single bare footprint in the mud. Somehow, for some reason I'll never know, there was someone else in that basement with us, silent, waiting, and listening in the dark over the fresh corpse of an old man.